to general questions. Yes?
The last slide you showed, do I read this properly? I don't know if it's still on the screen. The porcelain chap, has he got one type of stocking all the way to his ankle and another type all the way up his breeches?
I think one is falling down. Right. So the joke there would be about the attempt to dress finely, but in fact fail, and about fine dressing and also being dishevelled. So he's a kind of a rather diabolical figure and meant to amuse. Yes, this interest in different types of stripes, clashing garments, goes back to the dress of jugglers, court entertainers, mi-parti dressing of the medieval period, and this general interest in the ludic and the absurd, which is very much part of the way that macaroni jokes are constructed in the 18th century.
Thank you.
Yes? Yeah.
Oh, yes. Also, for you, I have a question about the satirical implications of the macaroni satires in caricature versus the caricatures of women with their towering hairstyles. And I wonder if you could talk a little more about whether there is a distinction in gender in the way each is caricatured.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is a term called macaroness, or a female macaroni, but this tended to be used only for women who were compulsive gamblers. Macaronis were associated with gambling, which is of course about excessive consumption, and therefore fits in well with the way that people were beginning to think about concerns about fashion. Too much spending, too much consumption, a kind of endless cycle. The expert on women and high hair is Gillian Russell, who has argued that the high hair for women in the period was actually often an important way in which women who were actresses, part of celebrity culture, but also women like the Duchess of Devonshire marked out a new kind of presence in public space. So it seems to be an important part of embodiment and public performance for women at the time. And there are quite a few images of where you pair a macaroni and a version of like a female macaroni, and they seem to partly be about anxiety that the genders are becoming too similar.
Great, thank you.
Did you see in the exhibition
Yes,
down the
the
street?
same topic.
Exactly.
Yes.
And have you measured any macaroni vests or waistcoats?
Well, strangely enough, during my sabbatical in 2015, 2016, I had a fellowship at Colonial Williamsburg, and we studied the American macaroni. And I was waiting for Pretty Gentleman to come out to then read it and finish this article. So
Too slow.
then I got this article, this project, but it's coming. You know, we're looking at the American macaroni and some of the advertisements on that don't seem to be caricatural, which was the interesting part because caricature is such a big part of the macaroni phenomenon. So
Fantastic.
and someday after this is done.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. I have a question for Anne Bissonette, where I'm completely sold and enthusiastic about your material culture approach. But given the title of your talk, where you raised the issue of politics, I was just wondering if you could project forward about how you might begin to relate your findings on the structures of 1790s garments to a political question.
So this is a very good question. We're at the midway point. I have a year, but likely 2 left. And so as most researchers who do the type of thing that I do, collecting the information, the data has been overwhelming in the past 2 years. And now I have to put an end sort of to the collecting and jump into the interpretation. So you never quite know what you're going to find when you embark in the kind of project that I decided to take on. And my initial goal was to link this to politics. And the initial hypothesis was that a lot of garments that ordinary people were wearing were actually worn by the elite. And we've seen that in earlier 18th century periods as well. So we found very few ordinary people's garments. So that Carmagnole that I showed you on the screen was one of them. There's only 2 that were able to be found. we're going to base what we know on the data, so we might not look at what the initial premise was going to be. So we have found objects that deal with politics, like that assignat fan that my graduate student is tackling is really interesting because it encapsulates this idea of the revolution trying to get money, as they were in dire need of money, to create this monetary instrument, but then they created too much of the money and then the rampant inflation occurred. Women were a big part of this issue of inflation and there are near famines happening in France at that point. So how do women have a say into flashing their assignat fan to either be supportive of the revolution or declaring the issues that the revolution led to, so the near famine, for example. So we're trying to figure out how this fashionable instrument and how it was, we found it in caricature as well. So there are things that relate to politics that we're exploring and that I'm letting Patricia take on for her dissertation. But some of the things that I'm finding, I think I would forever be looking at structure to try to figure out what I can learn from this. To try to map the changes, issues of embodiment that also relate to politics, because neoclassicism and politics in some ways were linked, and so these political practices, the Republican structure, for example, and the idea of using women's bodies as a demonstration of Greek and Roman aesthetics, that goes hand in hand. So that's where the embodiment and the politics and the, artistic development are sort of joining in strange and mysterious ways. So I also found out more about myself as a researcher in the process, in that I have to look at the minute, I have to look at the stitches, I have to look at the alteration, I have to look at things that bring me away from things that I thought I would find and that I'm currently finding. So I don't know where this will lead, and I'm hoping, and I know that in some ways it will lead to politics, because that's where I was trying to go. But this may take me more than the next 2 years. It's sort of, there's too much data. What do you do with too much, looking at all the fashion plates and trying to get, for example, students to quantify things? And then I meet with students and I say, well, what does this mean? What does this proportion of XYZ mean? And how does this relate to societies? And one of the things that we found that I think is international, separate developments, especially when France did not have fashion plates and ways to communicate readily the fashions in France between 92 and 96. We find the Germans were doing something very different than the English, and by the time the fashion plate starts to be produced in Paris again in 97, there's an outcry on how much embodied, close to the body garments, and people see this as very devastating to them, this idea of not being gradually brought into a greater body delineation, but being forced into it, which also leads to the same thing as when the macaronis were told they were being too French or they were being too continental. So there's an issue of nationalism that come into play with embodied dress behaviors.
So if you have any more questions, I recommend that you speak to our speakers over coffee during this break. And I thank them both for speaking.